Welcome to The Exchange. I'm your host, Anthony Curry. Rob Cox is still away braving typhoons in Hong Kong. Today we're talking about big banks, bailouts, and what we have and haven't learned from the financial crisis. My guest is Neil Borowski, a former Special Inspector General in charge of oversight for TARP and author of the new book, Bailout. Well, Neil, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we sort of dig into the machinations you describe in your book and what we can learn from that, this morning, Sandy Wild, former CEO of Citigroup, and of course the guy who created Citigroup and had a plaque on his wall saying "Shatterer of Glass-Steagall," says, well, maybe we should split up the banks. What's your reaction to this former scion of this kind of fantastically huge organisation saying, I'm done with it?
I mean, it's conflicting, right? So on the one hand, it's a remarkable amount of chutzpah, the guy who was responsible for creating these super banks that really helped bring down our entire financial system in 2008, suddenly saying, whoops, my bad. But on the other hand, as someone who's been an advocate for breaking up the banks, since I was at SIGTARP and I was back in the government, I welcome him on to Team Break 'em Up.
It's very difficult to now ignore the movement, I think, considering you've now got this massive convert in the form of Sandy Wild. You might not believe his arguments, but you can't now just ignore them necessarily.
No, absolutely. And look, this has been gaining momentum over the last year and a half. There was a few of us who noted that Dodd-Frank was not going to work. It was not going to rein in the excesses of too big to fail banks, that were on our path toward another financial crisis. And it's great to see, again, people jumping on the bandwagon. Now, we still have a long way to go, given the control the banks have and the power that they have in Washington. But it's great to have someone from the inside who is such a beneficiary and advocate to acknowledge that it is a broken system that's hurting the country.
Now, we can look at what happened first. Lending started getting out of whack, and smaller lenders went under first. And then you had some of the smaller banks getting in trouble. Actually, the commercial universal banks were among the last to get hit. You had Bear Stearns going under Lehman Brothers. So one could argue, actually, it wasn't Glass-Steagall necessarily that killed it. It was just that the system itself had too many excesses.
No, and I think that's right. And I think Glass-Steagall alone is not the solution, but it's part of the solution. Too big to fail is the problem. It all traces back. I mean, technically, the problem, of course, was with the destruction of underwriting practices and the diffusion of responsibility and risk in a way that ended up actually concentrating it because of the series of regulatory rules. But the more important fact is that we had banks that were enjoying the implicit guarantee of government bailout, and that ultimately is what led to that incredible risk-taking, and which will, once again, create another financial crisis if it's not addressed. So we have to find measures to end that implicit guarantee because it just perverts the market. So
you're thinking if you shrink them, also there are other things that have come in, leverage is less. Parts of the Volcker rule within Dodd-Frank are pretty good at saying do not go around betting your own money if you actually get the benefit of a potential federal bailout if you're a bank. So those things are always sort of set in stone almost. I mean, what else would you suggest as...
But those things are not real. I mean, I'm sorry, they're just not real. I mean, the Volcker rule has already been gamed. It will continue to be gamed. It's not going to prevent the risk-taking. It'll just migrate around the rules and find new areas.
But of course, the best thing, the funniest thing actually about the Volcker rule is it says we're banning proprietary trading apart from in government securities and agency securities, which is 40% of the market.
I mean, it's ridiculous. And one of the things I count in the book is that we interviewed Geithner back in late 2010, and he acknowledged that banks are basically going to migrate around the rules, and that if things go bad, we're going to have to do extraordinary things again. We have to do something along the lines of Sandy Wild and his advocacy of breaking up the banks and making it so that one can fail without bringing down the entire system with them. That's essential.
Well, let's move on to the book. Now, not to belittle it, I think it's a fantastic book. I love the insights you give and the way you describe things and your honesty, frankly. You are very good at saying where you think you made a mistake. But if I were to characterize the book, I would say to some extent there's a naivety in there. And I look at it, say, for example, the impact of the book may be a bit akin to Greg Smith. You remember the guy from Goldman Sachs who gave his resignation letter? And I look at the book and I think, okay, I mean, I know a bit about Washington, a bit about finance. I think I'm not that surprised by the machinations I see in this book. Not to say that you're the Greg Smith of government, you're not at all. But what impact do you want this book to have?
Well, I would say that I went in a little bit naive, not entirely naive. I had a career as a prosecutor. I dealt with the Department of Justice, and I had a taste of the nastiness of Washington, its juvenile behaviors. So I didn't go in completely blind, but I was still surprised mostly at just how much power the banks had and how much it affected the decision-making process. And what I hope to do with this book is I think most people in this country are angry and they're angry whether they're on Occupy on the left or the Tea Party on the right or everywhere in the great middle. And they have these feelings, but they don't have the evidence that supports that this anger is justified and rational. And what I hope to do with this book is give specific examples that they're right. They actually are right that our government has been co-opted by the interests of the largest banks. And that's really what I hope to do, is provide that evidence so they can rise up and join me and Sandy Weil and others in demanding a change of our financial system.
And what would you, if you were to point to one thing in the book, and you have a lot of examples in there, if you were to say one thing encapsulates how the banks have captured Washington, what would you say it is?
I would say it's hard to pick one. It's like, which child do you love the most? Because I think there's so many good examples. But one part of TARP that was supposed to help Main Street and struggling homeowners, it was part of the part and parcel of how they got the bill passed. It was supposed to help up to 4 million people stay in their homes. And that program and what Treasury did to it is a great example. And it really started at the very beginning when we confronted Secretary Geithner. Actually, Elizabeth Warren, who was head of a congressional panel, confronted him in a meeting that we were at. And his response was, well, that this program is going to help, and the quote is, foam the runway for the banks. So even this program, and by that he meant extend out the foreclosure crisis to benefit the banks. So here it is, the one program that was really supposed to help struggling homeowners in Main Street became one that benefited the banks and really no one else.
I suppose that was one of the big issues they had at the time, though, and I know you acknowledged some of the good things that the likes of TARP accomplished, which was, how do we make this huge problem of mortgages within a system where a lot of it was held off balance sheet actually work? And then the added problem of, if there are homes in foreclosure, the process of securitizing these loans makes it so much more difficult to restructure them. We still have that issue today. So I can see to some extent where he's coming from, but you're saying it sounded to you like it was much more of just a sop to get this thing passed.
Well, again, you have to look at the behavior. So you can take his words about that this was really about foaming the runway, but then you look at the conduct that followed the behavior, and it was consistent with that. You know, the banks didn't follow the rules, their mortgage servicing arms of HAMP. They violated them terribly and used HAMP as an opportunity in many cases to squeeze out the last remaining savings of struggling homeowners before throwing them on the foreclosure scrap heap. And again, this wasn't an accident. This was a result of choices. Treasury put incentives into the system that rewarded the banks for foreclosing by letting them ring up late fees, for example, even when a borrower was totally performing. And then Treasury refused to hold them accountable. And when we were pushing them and saying, look at all these violations, what are you going to do about it? The first response was, well, if we get tough with them, we're afraid to leave the program, giving you a sense of where the leverage really lies in Washington. And then second, just coming up with excuse after excuse to not hold them accountable.
I mean, the idea that banks in trouble are going to leave a program because they're going to get oversight seems a little bit bizarre to me, I've got to be honest.
Yet that was something I heard from day one when I was serving under the Bush administration and all the way through the end, so I was serving under the Obama administration, this constant refrain, we don't want to offend the banks.
Well, let's look to another part. It's one of the bugbears I always had about TARP, which was Secretary Paulson at the time saying, let's put injections of capital into the banks so that they can then lend. Now, I always thought that's a really dumb idea. You put the capital into the banks to make sure they don't go under. Whether they lend or not is a very, very tricky process to engage in, especially as a government. We've seen Argentina try it recently. The UK government keeps on trying and finally has some kind of small scheme that actually looks like it could work. Whether it's a good scheme is another matter. But you go on about this in the book, and it seems as if you're saying they should have lent. I rather get the impression that it's not quite as simple as that from your perspective.
Well, the first part, the problem is that they announce a program as a lending program, and they sell it to the American people in Congress as a lending program, and then they give the money, and they don't put anything attached to the program to achieve that policy goal. No incentives to lend, saying, hey, here's your interest rate on your preferred stock, and it'll come down if you increase your lending. No penalty, no requirements. Some policy to accomplish that goal. And I think it's very cynical to give giant piles of money and say it's a lending program and not do anything to try to affect that lending.
So if they'd have given the money over and said, look, we're doing this just to keep the banks in order, nothing about lending, nothing else, that would have been much more acceptable. The lie is the problem, not so much whether or not they could have used the money to lend.
Exactly. And you know what? Maybe if they did that, they wouldn't get the money in the first place. And that's called democracy. And you know, you're not supposed to be able to misrepresent or announce a policy that you never intend on fulfilling. But the blame doesn't land just with Hank Paulson. I mean, these were policies that were continued on to the next administration.
And you looked at REFCO a few years ago before you went to TARP, and you prosecuted one of the guys who was there and helped with the fraud in 2005 and before. And yet we've seen two other futures firms go under with allegations of fraud around them. regulators are not up to speed, it seems. What, from what you've learned at your time in Washington, would you say to those looking at how to reform the system beyond just reducing the banks?
We have to look at the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington. One of the incidents in the book that I talk about was when I was told point blank that because of my aggressive stance, I was harming myself and harming my future by a very senior Treasury official, but that if I pulled back and changed my tone, was a little bit more upbeat, there would be potential rewards for me either in Wall Street or with a better appointment in Washington. And that dynamic is presented to every regulator. Maybe not as explicitly as I heard it, but we have to change a culture of Washington which encourages and incentivizes regulators not to do their jobs. And that comes from the revolving door and that promise of a giant pot of gold at the end of the Wall Street rainbow. And we really have to attack that and, of course, remove the corrupting influence by breaking up the banks, like Sandy Weil says.
So just to get this on the record, you're now back up in New York working at one of the universities. Are you happy in your current job?
Oh, I love teaching. I'm teaching at NYU Law, and I'm having a ball. And it was really that experience that helped convince me to write this book. So it's been great.
Well, Neil, that's a great response. Thanks for coming in. It's great to have you on the show. My name's Andy Curry. Join us again next time for another episode of The Exchange.